All right, I have two more sections of emotional behaviors, and I did not actually realize that this is part four already. So I have kind of gone way over of what I expected, and I'm trying to cut things out that I feel like I can. And sometimes I'm gonna leave some of the wording in the slides, but skip over the slide and just kind of say you can read because so that I can spend less time but still use the words with the pictures as I often do when I'm lecturing, but then the words are on the next slide or something. Um, it also means that I'm not going to get to talk about stress and health, it was either attack and escape behaviors or stress and health that had to go. And I really like the information, and I think it's interesting about attack and escape behaviors. And so for stress and health, I'm going to skip that section and just say that if so it's always good to know more about how stress works if that's something you want to know about and to go look into that autonomic nervous system response and what it's doing as we are living in sort of more prolonged stressful times and what that's doing to the immune system. And there are, as usual in these books, a lot of really negative information of how stress hurts our immune system. And then if you're really concerned about that, you can go watch the Kelly McGonigal. If you can try and look her up, I think the title of the TED Talk is How to Make Stress Your Friend, or Making Stress Your Friend, or something of that nature. And it really does help us to think through. I find it helpful to think through how stress is really preparing the body for behaving in a courageous way, and to some extent, it's partly how we think about our stress, and just to keep that in mind. So I knew I had to do the talk about the basic emotions, even though even these are now controversial. Everything's controversial in psychology as science keeps finding more information, and then also how we communicate about emotions. Paul Ekman was one of the people who did some early research and discovered the 6 basic emotions, and so I'm going to walk through them: happy, angry, sad, surprised, disgust, and afraid or fearful. And we can see those on these people's faces. There might be one or two that are a little bit more ambiguous, but we can pretty easily put those into those 6 different categories. And one more thing I just want to put in there is that this is also examining these 6 basic emotions where we have the labels and we have the facial expressions, and people are told to make these facial expressions, and so they are relatively unambiguous, whereas what often happens is we have this ambiguity of emotions where we have some surprise and then disgust, or anger and then a softening, and our emotional expressions, our emotions themselves are not that clear cut or unambiguous, and without those labels that are really matching with the sort of matching task, it is more difficult to recognize. I'm just repeating that basic assumption here from Ekman and Friesen that comes from Darwin, and then showing this picture of so the person on the top has just won her wrestling match, and she is a sighted person, and you can see not just the facial expressions but the body language, which I'm also going to talk about a bit here. And the person on the bottom in B there, he is congenitally blind, and he has just won his wrestling match, and you can see that the body expression and facial expressions are very similar. So we do see this similar kind of thing in people who are congenitally blind. It does not look like we have to learn facial expressions. And Callatt makes the point that we rarely interpret emotion based solely on facial expressions. So, as I said, 2 or more expressions can be present in a single facial expression. Our emotions are rarely this unambiguous, I'm happy and I'm only showing happiness, or I'm angry and I'm only showing anger. They're usually much more mixed than that. We use a great deal of body motion and body language to tell us about a person's emotions. And so he has a great picture in the book. I have taken a different picture from a different book because it was just available to me over to the right there of athletes, where it's really difficult to tell by their facial expression that whether or not they won or lost. We can tell a lot more about their posture, but we can also tell things about based on context. So some people say, of course she won, she's wearing the gold medal. There's the context. We see gestures. So down below at A, B, and C, you can make some guesses about whether or not what those gestures are meaning. I don't completely remember, and I usually get a lot of really different responses that do not match. This is from that Discovering Behavioral Neuroscience by Laura Freeberg, but I think A is supposed to be surprise, and B, I don't know what that is, but it's kind of giving this up in the air, not really a lot of strong emotion. And then C is this kind of, what's going on, maybe a little bit of, I don't know what that is actually. And people, and when I have my classes guess, they're off from what Freeberg said, but the point is we can tell that they are expressing different emotions. We would not put those into the same emotional categories, and that's based on gesture. I usually tell the story here of I have listened to an FBI agent, and this one of those books on tape or books on CD where he's describing how to read body language and tell if people are lying, which is something Paul Ekman ended up getting involved with as well, but not for the FBI, but for different groups. So this is an FBI agent trained in reading body language, and he has this great example of if you have your what's called arms akimbo, so your arms on your hips, or your hands, your fists on your hips and your arms out, that has this kind of, if I talk to you like that, and if you can just go ahead and put your fists on your hips and talk to someone and kind of nod your head up and down, even if you're saying something really benign, it starts to sound a little bit like someone's in trouble, right? Because you start to feel like you're talking to someone like they're in trouble. So we have these gestures, and he talks about how this is so we've had animals and dogs as domestic for so many generations. We've trained them to do certain things, but even our dogs can tell the difference between arms akimbo and what you might call, what I would say, C. So when your arms are out open like that. And I can't remember how he described that. And I actually tried that with my dog, who used to never come when I called him. And I wondered if I was using arms akimbo, and I started putting my arms open like that, and he did start coming better when I called. So have someone talk to you like that, a couple, just a few words with each of those gestures, and notice the difference in your own just emotional response to that, regardless of what they're saying. We also have tone of voice, which is so I think it was the last time I taught this class. I was on my way into class. I had already had a couple of kind of bad things happen to me that day, and on my way into work, I almost hit a pedestrian. She walked right in front of my car, and it was a green light. I had a green light, and I was, speeding up because I knew I had to get through that green light pretty quickly. I know how the lights work, and I knew that I needed to get there. So I was speeding up to go through that green light, and she had those noise canceling headphones on, and she was just bebopping across, and I was already in a state of not being very happy. And I had to screech my brakes and honk, and I rolled down my window, and I yelled at her, and I was cussing, and other people were looking at me, and twice that day when I got in, people asked me, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Fine." And they both said, the one guy said, "Really?" And my teaching assistant said, "You are not fine." And we can tell by a person's tone of voice, even just with the word fine, whether or not that person is really fine, or maybe kind of angry still. I've actually talked about emotion now in a number of ways with the circumplex model, which is one kind of theory of how emotion works, with our emotional theories, our kind of background. But now there's 6 basic emotions, which one of the things I meant to say there too is, so one of the things is of controversy now is, are there 6 basic emotions or 8 or 9? People don't really agree. Scientists don't agree about that. But an alternative view to all of this can really look at emotions as varying along continuous dimensions. So weak to strong, pleasant to unpleasant, approach versus avoid. And while this looks a little bit like the circumplex model with the pleasant to unpleasant, pleasant and weak to strong, this is the idea that there are more these kind of continua of where we are in our emotional states. And if we take specifically the approach and avoid, that's a particular continuum that we can range between a feeling of avoidance versus a feeling of approach. One of the people who's looked into this a great deal is Jeffrey Alan Gray. So in 1970, he distinguished between the behavioral activation system, or the BAS as it's called, and the behavioral inhibition system, or the BIS. And there are particular brain areas associated with these approach versus avoid emotions. So people with high BAS, so high activation or approach, they have increased activity of the left hemisphere, especially the frontal and temporal lobes. They have a lower or low to moderate autonomic nervous system arousal, and then a tendency to approach as this behavioral activation system is more active. These approach emotions are, we used to talk about this, or they used to talk about this as if you have more activity in the left frontal hemisphere, you're going to tend to be more happy, whereas if you have more activity in the right frontal hemisphere, you're going to tend to be more depressed. But what they realized later was it has to do with more maybe approach or activation, and so that's not just related to the emotion of happiness, it's also related to the emotion of anger. Then if we look at people with high BIS, so behavioral inhibition system, or increased kind of avoidance and inhibition of emotion and moving towards things, they have increased activity of right frontal and temporal lobes, increased attention and arousal, and so increased autonomic nervous system kind of response that's just kind of constantly there and a high level of arousal. Inhibited actions, and this is related to emotions of fear, really fear and disgust. I'm going to put depression in there as well, as we see people with high right frontal activity are more likely to be depressed. And in fact, we can see people who have, so they get damage to their left frontal lobe for some reason, and that pretty much guarantees they're going to start having some depression. If you have like a car wreck where you hit the front left frontal part of your brain. The other thing I think that's really important, that's really basic to talk about with emotions, is the functions of why. Why do we have these things called emotions? Because some of them clearly appear to have adaptive value. Okay, fear leads to escape, anger leads to attack, and sometimes we need to attack. Happiness just seems adaptive, as if we're always afraid and angry, what's sort of the motivation to live if you're never happy? But we might ask about the adaptive values of things like depression and more generalized anxiety. But these emotions that have the high adaptive values, they allow us to make quick decisions, and they help us to make moral decisions. People who are not able to feel fear or feel anger, they actually have a lot more aspects to their decision making. And then we're going to see emotions are really important for making moral decisions. There are 4 vignettes in the book, and I usually go through them all and talk about them with the class for a little while. I'm going to quickly go through the 3 that are part of this picture. You can read the book. The last one is comical, but these first 3 are the basic trolley problem, right? And the basic trolley problem was actually, if a trolley is coming down a track and you see that it's going to hit these 5 people, would you flip the switch so that it kills 1 person instead of 5 people? Okay, the trolley problem is a basic moral dilemma. The second one, though, so these other ones have kind of built off of the base. That's the basic trolley problem, but these other ones have built off of that, and so they ask, so okay, the train is coming down the track. This is a description, but here there's a relatively heavyset person on a bridge with you, And you figure out that if you pushed that heavyset person into the way of the trolley, that it would slow the trolley down enough that the people would notice it. And don't start getting all logical on me and say, why don't you just yell at the people, or why don't you jump in front of it yourself, or any of those things, because that's not the way the trolley problems work. So in this one, you are pushing someone in order to save that. You're pushing them in the way of the train to save those 5 people. And the third one is, would you push someone off of a sinking lifeboat if it seemed like the lifeboat could only hold 5 people, and you are on there as well, and there are 6 people on the lifeboat? Would you push someone off the sinking lifeboat? Okay, usually, so I have you guys think about this. You might want to pause it and think about that for a second, but I'm going to walk through what usually happens in our minds with the first one. There is this moral dilemma. And there is a part of your brain, which I'm going to go ahead and, spoiler alert, tell you, it's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this area that's really right behind the eyes, okay, right in the middle and behind the eyes. That area of your brain goes, there's this, I just want to say there's this, kind of feeling. But a lot of us say yes, right? We are making a choice to kill 1 person instead of 5. In B, I usually have at least some people still raising their yes, I would do that. Other people would be no. Why? I mean, this is you're a much more active participant in the murder of a person when you are going to push them off the footbridge. And if you're like me, you'd be like, what makes me think I could push that person off the footbridge? They wouldn't just like throw me over or hurt me. But again, logic is not supposed to. That kind of logic is not part of the dilemma. But yeah, so most of us go, no, not everybody. And you can think, what did you feel? Like, well, maybe, yeah. But a lot of us go, no, that's a much more active participation. And I have even a stronger, I don't feel comfortable with that. In C, the question is, really, you're saying you're going to save your life and for your, not only the 4 others, but your own life. And a lot of people say yes, but again, I'm like, why wouldn't I just jump off the lifeboat? Why wouldn't we take turns? There's lots of logic that really doesn't work. And this one gets a little bit silly. And then the very last one is even sillier and shows us that there's definitely a point where you go, oh no, that's completely immoral. Okay, nobody would do that. So if any of those made you do this kind of, that would feel kind of wrong. And the decision is still, how much am I an active participant? How much am I not? But in any case, it's going to not feel right. And in the cases where you say, no, I would not do that at all, it feels that feels really wrong. And that feeling, I'm going to say, is in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's not in but that's the area that is giving you the kind of conscious aspect of the emotional pieces and parts of these decisions. So what are the emotional consequences of my decision? He brings up here, maybe for the second time, maybe just for the first in the book, because I talked before about Phineas Gage, who was the man who had the tamping iron go through his left cheek and out through the middle, so it actually went and damaged his ventromedial prefrontal cortex. That a lot of that story, we don't exactly know what happened because it's become almost an urban legend. There's just been lots of stories about Phineas Gage, and it occurred a long time ago. But more recently, Antonio Damasio and his wife have looked at a particular patient who had a tumor behind his eyes and then had it removed. But by the time he had it removed, it had done enough damage, and with the surgery and everything they did enough damage to his ventromedial prefrontal cortex that he seemed to be missing those gut feelings and the ability to realize the emotional consequences of his actions, and he could anticipate what was likely to happen. And so so they gave him this example of you get a bunch of extra cash at the bank, do you keep it? And he says something like, well, I could go to jail, the person could get in trouble, then I would have this extra money. And as he's going through the different look, these are the possible consequences. They ask him, so do you keep it? And he says that I don't know. And eventually he says, sure, I would keep it. But those feelings, I might go to jail. The person might get in trouble. They don't seem to influence his behavior. And even the, oh, I could do all these things with the money, that kind of, those emotional consequences, they aren't really influencing his decision. There's just this kind of, yeah, money's good, kind of, more is good logic. So it's more about, for people missing that area of the brain, it's more about what is the logic? What does it logically make sense to do? So what Antonio Damasio calls this is the somatic marker. This is his somatic marker theory, that they're lacking, or this patient is lacking that somatic marker, which we can think of as that kind of gut feeling. And he's quoted as saying, emotions are inseparable from the idea of good and evil, because really our emotions such as happiness and pleasure and sadness and guilt and those consequences, they influence our decisions. So this particular patient, he lost his job, lost a lot of his money on get rich quick plans, lost his wife. We can't really make good decisions without that somatic marker. And I have one more decision-making game that they played, and I'm not going to go through all these different examples of what's going on with A, B, C, and D, but you can see if you just pause and read through them that A and B, it's not going to be good to draw through the cards. People with damage to, it's not going to be comfortable because you could possibly lose a lot of money. People with damage to the prefrontal cortex or the amygdala, they show no nervous tension drawing from stacks A and B, and they continue to draw from them. So we can make a lot of different kinds of bad decisions if we don't have those kinds of somatic markers. If we don't have the nervousness when we are likely to have negative emotional consequences.